Show with your host, Lonnie Clark. We stand together and accept that we now live in a world transformed by Fukushima. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time here on UCY.TV radio. We relentlessly engage every ear that listens. We expose and confront the complete lack of accountability for the nuclear industry. Consider social engineering programs who view our bodies, minds, and souls as assets on a balance sheet. We discuss vital current issues, interview activists, and engage our audience in an effort to allow all voices to be heard. The Age of Fission radio show creates a venue that all will choose. We encourage our listeners to reclaim their power and their courage to take action and save our planet from the ravages of greed and indifference. Our actions matter. Every voice matters. We remind our listeners that happiness is resistance. Love is greater than fear.
Ooh, I hear it.
I don't hear them.
I heard the music for like half a second.
I write her a message.
By the way, if we do get hooked in, I've got a call right after this. I won't be able to debrief that.
Good morning, UCY.TV radio listeners. This is Lonnie Clark with the Age of Fission radio show. We were having a little bit of difficulty, which is why you heard Chuck saying that. So we're with Chuck Johnson of Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility, who has to leave right away after our show. So... Thanks, Chuck, for joining us. We really appreciate it. We're super happy you're a friend of our show. We had a little bit of trouble logging in today, but we're super happy about that. So thanks for joining our show. And we want to thank KEPW also for carrying our show and being a friend of our show and affiliate. Today, you've been on, the last time you were on, we were going to talk about... I think one of the things we wanted to do was an update on 3053 because you were doing some lobbying in Washington on that. So why don't you give us some news on that one?
Well, that was the bill to change the Nuclear Waste Policy Act and allow for so-called temporary waste storage facilities to be established, most likely in either Texas or New Mexico. And also to reopen the Yucca Mountain Waste Repository project, which the Obama administration had canceled about 7 years ago. And I believe we went into the details as to what the problems were with that proposal. Mainly, Yucca Mountain has failed environmental tests. It's a very leaky site, even though it's out in the middle of the Nevada desert. It's when it does rain out there, the water goes straight through the Yucca Mountain site and down into the aquifers. So they were going to have to go to very extreme measures of 100 years after the waste had been put in the repository, adding titanium drip shields to the waste casks to keep water off of the casks so that they wouldn't deteriorate. and put radioactive waste into the aquifer, which extends all the way down to Las Vegas. So, there were technical problems with that site, and it's not the best type of rock to put something that's as dangerous for as long as high-level radioactive waste is. And then the other option of temporarily parking it out in the desert in New Mexico or Texas is the fact that you're moving this waste. Every time you move this highly radioactive, extremely dangerous material, you run the risk of a transportation accident. And we've had, as the environmental community has had as a principle for a very long time, that you move the waste once, that you make a decision on where the best place, the least bad place is to store the high-level waste, and then you move it once rather than having to move it twice. Plus, these communities are likely to end up being semi-permanent hosts for this material, which remains hazardous in their casks as the casks begin to deteriorate. Long story short, we really should stop making this stuff because it's really difficult to keep out of the environment. It's extremely deadly and dangerous. But since we have made some of it, we are going to ultimately have to figure out the best place to store it. But this solution, HR 30.
Oh dear. I think we lost Mr. Chuck there, folks. I think that's what happens. Let me see if I can get him back on the line. Well, there he is. Hold on. Let me see if I can link him back in. Lord, we're having some trouble. Now, I have to say, the little conspiracy theorist in me wants to say, I don't know if it'll allow... Well, I think we're all back on. I think that's it. I think it hooked him back in. Let's see if it'll call him.
Did I get cut off?
You did, and I called you back.
Okay.
And I believe we're back on the air and we're all connected.
Okay, so I think where I got cut off was I was talking about the fact that this legislation has not come up. Had I mentioned that?
You were talking about HR. Yeah, I think that's exactly where you were.
Yeah, HR 3053 was on the verge of passing in, as far back as mid-September. It was they were even talking about passing it in August. They've had the votes to do it for a while, but it just hasn't come to the House floor. And part of that is due to the overall chaos that has descended on Washington due to the very chaotic Trump administration and the fact that Congress, the Republican Congress, has not coalesced around much of anything until just recently. This horrendous tax proposal that gives money to rich people. They finally managed to pass that through both houses. But because there's been so much chaos on some of these bigger, higher profile issues, this issue of the creating a safety valve for the nuclear power industry with their waste stream hasn't come up for a vote yet, but probably will come out of the House before the end of the year. The word is, though, that in the Senate, there just doesn't seem to be any activity or action favoring similar legislation. And I think really what we can conclude is that what Jeff Fettis from NRDC, Natural Resources Defense Council, speculated a year ago is that the nuclear power industry likes the status quo. It likes the idea that it can point to things like HR 3053 as, the solution's on the horizon, but it doesn't want to get to that horizon because if it actually gets to that horizon and if they got permission to move the waste, then they wouldn't be able to they would end up having to starting to put money back into the National Nuclear Waste Fund, which they sued the federal government for permission. The utilities around the country that have nuclear reactors sued the feds after Yucca Mountain was canceled because there was no plan for what to do with the high-level waste. They successfully convinced judges that, hey, if the federal government doesn't have a plan for what they're going to do with our waste, why should we have to keep paying into the waste fund? And the judges agreed with them on that, so they're not having to do that. Plus, they can take money out of the waste fund to set up dry cask storage at their reactor sites. And so that's been happening all around the country. As the spent fuel pools next to reactors have filled up and there's no more room for them, they've built dry cask storage facilities, which are just basically a flat concrete pad with these designed casks to hold the radioactive material. And they've been able to take money from the waste fund to do that. So as financially strapped as nuclear power utilities have been, they don't, if they could avoid tens of millions of dollars of annual payment into the waste fund, then they're happy to do that, as long as they can point to things like this bill in Congress as being on the horizon for solving the problem. They can tell their constituents that the problem's solved. Then, but they don't actually have to solve it, because solving it would cost them money.
Right. They'll just let everybody get sick. So speaking of being sick,
that's why I think this is happening the way it is, because it doesn't make sense any other way. These guys have the clout to pass it in Congress if they wanted to. That's what it boils down to. It's not that the power of the anti-nuclear community is holding back
come on,
power.
Chuck. Don't tell us that first thing in the morning. Come on. Okay, so actually, speaking of making me sick, I saw NuScale up on some panel. Why don't you talk about that? That was shocking.
Oh, yeah. Well, NuScale's in a funny position because they're trying to portray themselves as this wonderful climate mitigator, like no carbon energy, we're clean power, et cetera, et cetera. And yet the Trump administration, they're the one source of low carbon power that the Trump administration likes, probably because they're dirty and nasty, and anything that's dirty and nasty, the Trump administration's going to be in favor of, especially if it makes a lot of money for wealthy people. So it checks all the boxes for something that the Trump administration likes. So anyway, NuScale found itself in the uncomfortable position of sitting on a panel at the Bonn climate talks with Peabody Coal and representatives of the gas industry and the Trump administration as the official Trump delegation to the Bonn climate talks. And so they were there promoting clean coal and natural gas, efficient natural gas, and NuScale, power as the U.S. contribution to the climate talks. So our executive director at Oregon PSR, Kelly Campbell, coined the phrase that NuScale is the clean coal of the nuclear power industry, which I thought was a pretty cute and apt description.
Were you there?
No, we were not. But we, we watched it on television. Yeah,
so
it was all streamed.
You work with the different organizations. What is the response, the European response to the United States doing shenanigans like that? What was their response to that?
Well, they were, people. Nuclear power was kind of a side stream on this. I mean, most of the environmentalists don't support nuclear power, but the activists were there mainly to protest the fact that you were bringing a coal company, Peabody Coal, to the climate talks, and having them talk about burning more coal as part of the solution to the climate problem.
That's kind of like asking Satan to come to Christmas Mass, you know what I mean? Like, really, honestly.
And Lenka Kolar, who was works for NewScale in their D.C. office, was sitting right next to the representative of Peabody Coal, and you know, this is the bedfellows that NewScale finds itself with, and it just shows that it's the same type of thinking that leads to clean coal that leads to new nuclear. I mean, new nuclear is proving itself to be... Clean nuclear,
clean coal, same thing.
Yeah, obviously the pollutants in nuclear power are different ones, but and the economics of nuclear is worse than just about anything. I mean, you're looking right now. I just was reading the papers in the South. I get a feed into my phone that the public service corporation or of Georgia has recommended, or the regulators, utility regulators in Georgia are recommending that their commission cancel and shut down the Vogtle Westinghouse nuclear reactor new build, just like South Carolina did several months ago. So the 4 reactors that Westinghouse has been trying to build in the United States, 2 of them have been canceled in South Carolina. The other 2 in Georgia, their utility regulators are saying it's going to cost ratepayers billions to finish these reactors, and they should be closed. The construction should be closed down. Nuclear power is just flat out failing. New build nuclear is failing in the United States and in Europe too, for that matter. The only place where it seems to be working is places like China and Russia, where you don't have a free market economy. It works better in sort of planned economies where it doesn't matter if you overspend.
Or kill your people. I mean, right. the other part in those 2 countries is they're not forthcoming about the issues, the overcost, the runs. I mean, they can easily lie. They can manipulate the numbers. They can choose
right.
to do what they want. And they can look at the long term because of the structure of their governments. They can just like eliminate telling the truth and say, well, we believe that in 50 years, this is the answer. So if we lose 50 million people, that's the cost of building nuclear power for the state. That's just the way it is. And that really right. is a lot of their attitude.
You don't have quick feedback in those countries. And obviously, if it doesn't have to meet a market test, and you're pouring extra money into it, obviously, if you continue to do things that lose money, it has an impact on you. But the resources of a big government like China are much huger than even the largest of our corporations in the United States, which obviously Westinghouse and Toshiba have gone bankrupt on their nuclear. But China, again, they also don't have, as much as we deride our nuclear regulator here in the United States and talk about how toothless they are, they're toothier than the nuclear regulators in China, much more stringent. And I'm actually really concerned that the next nuclear accident might end up being in China, because they're building so many reactors so quickly right now. And the quality control is something we should all be concerned about.
Mm-hmm. Because
but those are the only places where it's happening. The places like that can afford to subsidize it, and everywhere else it's failing. Even Europe and the United States that previously were able to, they had economic problems, but they were able to successfully complete some reactors. It doesn't look as though either Areva, the French company, or Westinghouse, so far, neither of them have been successful in finishing any of their new reactors. Areva's 10 years behind with their reactor new build in Finland, and I just mentioned the reactors that Westinghouse has been trying unsuccessfully to build in the South. So,
well, isn't it worth it's in their vested interest to be behind, because they keep charging the government money. Isn't this like
well, but there are limits. This is where the regulators in Georgia, we'll see how much spine the commission has. That the staff recommended that they not allow Georgia Power to continue to build these reactors and charge the ratepayers for them. But the 5-member commission now has to decide if they're going to accept the staff recommendation or if they're going to go along with the utility. And I wouldn't bet against the utility. So it may take a bit longer for those reactors to eventually get canceled, but I expect they will be. They're still projecting they won't be done until 2023 or 2024 now, which is, I think, 8 years past when they were supposed to be completed initially. They've only spent half the money that they expect they would have to spend to finish them right now. I think they're looking at $25 billion with a B dollars to complete these 2 reactors, which is just, incredible amount of money. Double what they originally thought it would cost.
I saw a story that said that Georgia's nuclear reactors could be canceled like South Carolina's.
Right.
So
that's what this recommendation is from the staff of the Georgia regulators. That's what that was.
Well, I think that I don't know. I mean, maybe you're right. Maybe it's not exactly the activism that's slowing the train down, but just the sheer economic failure of the industry.
That's definitely true, because as much as we've tried to alert even the environmental community to the dangers of nuclear power, environmental community, for good, valid reasons, has been very much more concerned about climate issues than they have been about the dangers of nuclear power, radiation, and so forth. And therefore, we haven't had as much support from the rest of the environmental movement as we had gotten in previous generations. And the other side has had some traction in terms of making the argument that this is uses less carbon and therefore it has to be part of the solution and so forth. But they just haven't been able to make it happen. Their credibility is just getting more and more ragged as time goes on.
I'll be honest. For me, the credibility of the environmental movement really, I have no respect for 350.org or Greenpeace in regards to their stance on nuclear. For their short-sightedness to see that nuclear pollution does not contribute to greenhouse gases, to me, and to make no effort to study it. They made no effort to study it.
350, we've been talking to 350 in Eugene about eWeb and their involvement through purchases of Bonneville Power Administration electricity in the Columbia Generating Station nuclear plant at Hanford. And they're very interested in endorsing an effort to get that plant shut down. That's Damon Mott's story from our staff has had conversations with the 350.org chapter there, and they get it, that it's not just an issue of the danger of the reactor, which should be enough in and of itself, but there's also just the whole nuclear fuel chain and how it the uranium mining is something that has been done in Native American lands throughout the United States and Canada, and it has it's something that is extremely destructive to the environment and to those communities, and that's something that 350.org carries weight with them. I think we're, as the credibility of the nuclear power industry fades, we're going to get increasing help from the environmental community.
You mean as their contribution?
We saw that in Portland too. The environmental community rallied around. There were a couple of resolutions early in the year. One at Portland City Council, and the other with the Multnomah County Commission on charting the future energy plan for Portland and Multnomah County. And all the environmental groups agreed that nuclear power had to be kept out of it. That and the thing that proved most controversial was whether or not wood wastes being burned at logging mills and so forth, at forest products mills would be included, and that was also not included. But nuclear power was really not even that controversial. We had strong support from Sierra Club and all the other groups came in line saying that nuclear is not part of the solution. So I'm real encouraged by that.
Well, one of the things also is this thing that happened yesterday at Bear Ears in Utah. They're not just going to be fracking and pipelining, but they're going to be doing uranium mining also.
Right.
That's going to be very big. I mean, that's the interesting thing. I'm glad to hear that 350.org is beginning to sort of change its method, and maybe that's where the anti-nuke movement has really made an impact, is on the environmental groups, helping them to understand.
True.
Because
I think that's it.
Really, where you see fracking, where you see pipelining, you see uranium mining almost all the time. I mean, they kind of go hand in hand. I've noticed this. And it's really interesting. I have a question to ask you that you may actually, I don't know, I've never asked you this before, but do you know if the uranium mining corporations are subsidiaries of the oil companies? Are they independent?
Well, it's hard to generalize about large corporations because they interlock in a lot of unusual ways. But generally speaking, I would say no from what I've seen. The mining operations tend to be different from the oil and gas exploration operations for some reason. It's different technology primarily. I don't really see that. I can't really remember it. It seems like the big uranium mining companies are based in Kazakhstan, Russia, Canada, and Australia, and they seem to be. I don't really remember there being a lot of crossover with oil and gas. Okay,
it just occurred to me because I noticed that they were always sort of wherever you see pipelining, you see uranium mining. It's kind of a weird thing. So I just wondered, they're just probably sister organizations or something like that.
They're just, again, the kind of thing that big money politicians love. They're big and dirty, and they got lots of cash. So, they're, like you say, sister organizations or brother organizations, however you want to put it.
Yeah. I want to also ask you, what was the? Oh my God! As we talked about it, the question just left my head. For goodness sakes, Chuck. I wanted to know if you knew anything about the nuclear leaks that's coming out of North Korea.
Oh, out of North Korea? Oh, okay. Yeah. I thought you were going to say about the ruthenium in Russia, but we can talk about both of those things.
Well, you can talk about the ruthenium, either one. You're welcome.
I'll talk about that next, but I think that it's sounding as though the nuclear weapons testing they were doing has breached. It's been underground nuclear weapons testing, and it sounds as though they
that big 50-meter hole that they created, the thing has collapsed. Do you think that's what's causing it, or do you think it's a new deal? Is it the same site? Is it the same site? Like, have they used a different site?
I haven't studied it, but from my little bit of reading that I did in the news, that's what it looks like to me.
That's a very
And
big deal because that's a lot. I
mhm.
mean, even China put out a warning that if that happens, uh, the northern hemisphere is going to be subjected to high levels of radioactivity.
Well, yeah. I mean, we blew off a lot of nuclear weapons above ground for decades before we required that they put them underground with the limited test ban treaty that Kennedy and Khrushchev signed in 1963. So, I mean, they actually can measure. It's measurable. You can figure out. I mean, the way that you can tell if something is modern time is the radioactive elements that can be found from all that nuclear weapons testing that deposited all around the world. So we significantly increased the radioactivity that people are exposed to in the world with nuclear weapons testing. Now, the amount that North Korea is adding to that isn't going to be that much more, but anything is bad. We don't want to add more to it. So, yeah, in that sense, it's bad. It's worse for the people who live close by. And that's the same with this ruthenium leak that's happened in Russia. They were finding trace amounts of it in Europe, which were not, I mean, again, any amount you don't want, but it was less dangerous to someone in France than it certainly is for the communities that are right next to the facility in Russia where it's leaking. And it's apparently some sort of process for using ruthenium in some sort of commercial device is what it looks like, because it's only that element. Ordinarily, if it were an accident of another type, you'd have all kinds of different radioactive elements being discovered. But the Russians are being completely mysterious about it. They didn't even want to admit that it had happened until it was picked up and publicized by the Europeans. They basically said nothing about it until after that. And then they first tried to pretend like it wasn't them, but then now they're sort of admitting that, yeah, it was, but they're not being specific about what exactly has happened. So those who sort of want to excuse Vladimir Putin for, gosh, he's just misunderstood or whatever. No, it's possible for our own government, the United States, to be duplicitous and nasty, and also for the Russians to be duplicitous and nasty. Some people on the left have trouble with the concept that maybe both of our governments might not be working in the best interest of their people and of the world. But there are a lot of problems in Putin's Russia, and one of them is its addiction to nuclear energy and to nuclear weapons. Russia has been the most successful in getting countries around the world to sign contracts for new nuclear reactor construction. They have contracts all over the world. Some of them are just paper, with countries that have no money to actually finish a reactor. There's one with Jordan where Jordan doesn't have the water resources to cool a reactor. And it's not a wealthy country either. It doesn't have the oil wealth to waste on a nuclear reactor. And nonetheless, they have a contract with the Russians. And a number of African countries have contracts with the Russians. The most controversial right now is South Africa, which does have some money. It's not as poor as some of the other African countries. But the corrupt government of South Africa is trying to push through a contract to build, I think it's, 4 or 6 new Russian-style reactors at enormous cost. And the Jacob Zuma government's trying to get it through before Zuma has to leave office. And he's being resisted by some other people in the African National Congress, and then also the other parties that are in the parliament are fighting it. But Russia's a bad actor internationally on the export of nuclear reactors. And again, these are just old style reactors. They have the advantage of not doing what Westinghouse and Areva have done, which is to try to design a reactor that's safer. The Russians didn't even bother with that. They're just, going to build some of their old reactors, which they already have a design for, and therefore they're cheaper to build. But the Areva and Westinghouse reactors have proven to be extremely difficult to complete based on their designs. So they've taken themselves out of competitiveness internationally.
But what's it called? Ruthenium leak, that 106 that was all over Europe last about 2 weeks ago, I guess, 3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
That was caused, as it turns out, they think, by Russia's nuclear reprocessing plant. So Russia is not forthright about what their actions are and what they're doing. And, the other issue is really, we're not in a peacetime state on the planet. And there are, the people that want to take action against the great powers, the hegemons on this planet, every single nuclear power facility is a target for devastation. I mean, I honestly, my hair curled when I started hearing that the Middle East is going to develop, Saudi Arabia is going to start mining its own uranium and building its own nuclear power plants. That, to me, is a recipe for death. I honestly, I just can't comprehend that the nuclear industry would allow that to happen.
Well, it's controversial in the U.S. government because in the Obama administration, they wanted to reserve the right to have nuclear weapons to the existing nuclear weapon states and prevent proliferation. So that Iran deal that the Trump administration is criticizing them for does keep Iran, delay them from developing the capacity to build nuclear weapons for at least another decade. It buys some time. And they also were not in favor of any of these schemes to get Saudi Arabia capable of building nuclear weapons. Now, under the Trump administration, they don't seem to care about that stuff as much. And no, they were not supporting. There were people trying to get them to support it, but now it looks as though the Saudis are going to go ahead and start building some reactors, and they're going to try to. If the United States doesn't give them permission to enrich fuel, they'll maybe sign a deal with the Russians or somebody else who doesn't care. And the idea is they want to have the ability to enrich uranium, which would give them the capacity to build nuclear weapons. That's the whole reason they're interested in nuclear power. Because Saudi Arabia is to quote, I forget who said this, but they're the Saudi Arabia of solar power. Because not only are they sitting on oil reserves, but they're sitting on a very sunny patch of Earth. They don't need to develop nuclear energy. It would be much cheaper for them to develop solar.
Let's be clear,
nuclear energy gives them the opportunity to make nuclear weapons.
Exactly. That is really the reason that they view Iran as their enemy. So this is why Iran didn't want it. But this thing with Iran, that was a sweet deal. We've never had a nuclear oversight by the IAEA where they could walk in any time of day, 24 hours a day, unannounced and say, hey, we want to look at your nuclear facilities. That's never happened. Right. That was the first time that's ever happened. So to call the nuclear deal a bad deal is irresponsible, because it was frankly one of the best deals that the nuclear industry. It's a bad deal for the nuclear industry. For real, because it was
a bad deal for Iran's for Iran making nuclear weapons, definitely, but it was a good deal for stopping them from making nuclear weapons. And they saw it in their interest too, because Iran is tired of being economically isolated, and I think Iran is feeling that it can defend itself against the United States. North Korea developed nuclear weapons because they felt threatened by the United States with regime change. we brought this proliferation on ourselves, to a large degree, because of what we've done in invading Iraq and invading Libya, two countries that were trying to make weapons of mass destruction, and that we convinced not to do it. And then in the case of Iraq, we pretended to believe that they were still doing it anyway, as an excuse to invade them. With Libya, we didn't even have to pretend. They just had some indigenous uprisings going on, and we supported them, under the leadership of Hillary Clinton and the Obama administration. Yeah. And other countries that have
look what happened
been
now.
on our bad list, they look at that and they go, you know what? The United States doesn't think twice about invading us or trying to kill our leaders. We need some insurance that they can't do that. So it's, our warlike policy internationally threatens proliferation as much as any of the actions of any of the other countries in the world. We've got to get out of this addiction that we have in the United States that every international problem requires a military solution. It just
that is work. The United States' position. I mean, frankly, we've been co-opted by the industrial military complex. I mean, Chuck, be real. If our Congress said we're going to cut our military budget by 50%, that's still a lot of money. But if they said that, you know how many senators would disappear or have accidents? Seriously. There's just, honestly.
I don't even think they'd have to do anything. I mean, the advantage in the United States is you can do all of those disappearances legally through elections with campaign money.
Yeah, no doubt. They just erase them. I mean, exactly. And in fact, that's in fact, like even here with Pete DeFazio, they're still going to try to run Robinson. And in California, the governor, there's this guy named Michael Schillinger running for governor, and he is the founder and president of Environmental Progress, a nonprofit group that advocates for nuclear power across the country, and they strongly advocate to keep Diablo Canyon open and running. And that guy's running for the governor. Who's behind him? Lots of nuclear industry money. And I mean, it is, and the thing that they really are pushing for it, like they're saying that San Onofre was closed down incorrectly, that it was a source of clean nuclear energy for the power, and if he becomes governor, he wants to reopen it.
Yeah, I found that particularly hilarious because San Onofre died of self-inflicted wounds, as you probably know. They uprated their turbines, and the new turbines that were going to generate more electricity turned out that the tubes that carried water were too close to one another, created too much vibration, and cracked almost immediately. So basically, they were going to have to. They had just replaced all their turbines at their two reactors there. They were going to have to tear all of that out, either operate these things at much lower power, which is what they were asking for permission to do from the NRC, or tear it out, tear those brand new turbines out and replace them again. And just the cost of it all made 0 sense. It was so stinky that even the NRC couldn't approve it. They didn't want to not approve it, so basically they left Southern California Edison in limbo for a year and a half until finally Southern California Edison realized, well, the NRC is not going to approve us, so maybe we should do something different. So to think that Schellenberger thinks that somehow you can go back and revisit San Onofre at this point, he's on some sort of weird drug. It's not realistic in the slightest. I don't think his candidacy is realistic either in California. I'd be very surprised if he made it into the runoff. They have an open primary where everybody runs regardless of party, and then the top 2 vote getters make it into the general election. I don't think he'll be one of the top 2 vote getters. the two front runners right now are both Democrats. One is Lieutenant Governor Gavin Newsom, and the other is former mayor of Los Angeles, Antonio Rigoso. Rigosa, I guess is his name. Yeah. And I'm hoping it would be really bad if Schellenberger made it into the general and got a chance to run all of his propaganda on nuclear power. But he's been one of the so-called environmentalists for nuclear power.
Right. Right. He has been. I mean, it's really, it's beyond comprehension how blind the nuclear industry makes, the greed of the nuclear industry makes people, you know. Chuck, what have you been working on yourself?
Let me go. I want to go back to Schellenberger for a second, because there is a bit of a split among the people who a few years ago were involved in creating that movie Pandora's Promise, which was talking about how we needed a big ramp up of nuclear power in order to meet the energy needs of the world without frying the planet. And you know, some of the folks like Schellenberger have focused more on keeping the old reactors going. They've sort of realized, they've seen what's been happening with Westinghouse and Areva, and the fact that there was only one new nuclear power plant ordered in 2017. You know, they're just not building them at a rate that you would need to have a significant impact on climate change. So he's gotten off of that tack and more onto, he and James Hansen have been going around trying to promote subsidies and retention of all of the existing nuclear power plants and running them beyond their original design life of 40 years to 60 or even 80 years. And that's happening in Europe as well. You know, they're not successfully completing new reactors, but they're agreeing to extend the lifetimes of existing reactors. And then there are those others who are still holding on to that hope that a new reactor design will come along that will prove to be cheap and clean, and you know, the magic reactor will be found and revive the nuclear power renaissance that they have been calling for the last 15 years. So, but yeah, he's it's funny to refer to Schellenberger as being more realistic, you know, given that he's talking about somehow trying to revive San Onofre at this point. You know, I think it's 5 years after they've been shut down.
Well, he thought it was, but I mean, I think it's, he made this comment that it could be reopened, not that he's trying, but it could be. He thought it was prematurely closed. I mean, the whole thing is just incomprehensible how, I don't know. When you look at the facts, I mean, it's very simple. I made a really quick little YouTube video on my YouTube channel where I looked at the government's tracking of children with disabilities, and you can see them in regions. And I literally laid over it on top of it a map of nuclear facilities in our country. And you can literally see it bleed out. Like, they don't have scientific studies finding out what type of diseases are caused by these nuclear power plants, but all you have to do is lay it out, and it does propose a good thesis for someone to actually go study it. Let me just put it to you that way. It's a really good question to ask.
Well, I know in terms of leukemia, there have been leukemia studies in Europe around reactors, in Germany, France, and Great Britain. They've studied the incidence of childhood leukemia, which is something that is a pretty strong indicator of some radioactive, harm done to individuals, and found that there's a higher incidence of childhood leukemia around reactors. In the case of Germany and France, they felt it was significant. In the case of Great Britain, the researchers backed off and said it could have been due to margin of error. But add all three of those together as, I'm blanking on the researcher, but It's a
Chris
gentleman
Busby.
from...
Chris Busby.
No, not Nick. It's Ian Fairley.
Oh, yeah, okay, Ian Fairley.
He added all three of those studies together, which nobody else had. And, of course, they reinforce one another. And it makes it really clear that there is a direct relationship between the standard operation, perfectly legal operation of nuclear power plants, and an increase in leukemia around them. And that's just one disease.
Right,
there are probably
exactly.
others that could be
myocardial, like in Japan, in Fukushima, they're finding that the rates of acute, what does it say? I'm reading from nuclearnews.net. Acute myocardial infarction per 100,000 in Fukushima Prefecture is dramatically higher than the rest of the nation. So, and there's a whole list of other diseases. So the studies are, pretty strong that this is a very serious, it causes catastrophic events. Chuck, I wanted to give you the opportunity to share with people what you're up to and where you're going to be at. We have about 10 minutes left.
Okay. Yeah, I'm leaving Oregon and Washington PSR to take a job with International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War in Boston. I'm moving from Portland, Oregon to Boston. And my replacement is a guy named Damon Mott's Story, which you might want to consider having him on your show sometime. He's a very intelligent young man. He's been working with us for about the last year and a half. And it's been really helpful, especially on the small modular reactor work that I've been doing. But now he's pretty much picking up everything else. And he's going to be heading up the effort to get eWeb to take a position for closing the Columbia generating.
Awesome. Maybe you can give me his number. I'd love to have him on.
Yeah.
I'd actually love to meet him and join his
continues.
effort.
Yeah, the work continues, but I will be working on the nuclear weapons issue internationally in Boston. We have affiliates around the world that were involved in the nuclear ban treaty negotiations that took place eventually in New York and was passed in New York with 122 nations signing it, the initial document. And now our task is going to be getting countries to formally sign the treaty and then ratify it. And once 50 countries worldwide have done that, then the use or threat to use or development of nuclear weapons in any way will be illegal worldwide. And countries that persist in doing that, including the 9 declared nuclear weapon states, will be in violation of international law. Now, that isn't necessarily going to result in instantaneous disarmament, but it is the first step that begins to lead us that direction. Just as with landmine treaty, not every country signed on to it, and yet just about all of the countries of the world, two exceptions right now are North Korea and the United States, have started the process of demining all of the areas that have been mined, and there are international relief efforts to go into places that have had conflicts where a lot of landmines have been set, go in there and defuse those mines. I don't have any illusions that nuclear weapons is going to be as easy to accomplish as landmines, but if you stigmatize the weapon and recognize it for what it is, as a weapon that doesn't discriminate between armies and civilians, and that ultimately threatens the survival of our entire planet, in the case of a nuclear weapon, I think that begins the step-by-step process to getting countries to agree to have these verification systems put in place and agree to move all the way down to zero. And that's just as has been done in Iran and in other places that have decided that they're, for example, South Africa developed nuclear weapons under apartheid, and when they went to majority rule, they did away with their nuclear weapons capacity and allowed the IAEA to go in and inspect and everything else. We're hoping that some of the countries for whom nuclear weapons is less of a tool in their international policy and more of a trophy, like Great Britain. What is the reason for Great Britain to have nuclear weapons other than a giant expense on their treasury? Perhaps a country like that will be the first of the nuclear weapon states to agree to disarm. So I'm really looking forward to going to Boston and starting work on this. And as I said, the initial work is going to be trying to get our affiliates and our affiliated groups around the world to get their governments to sign the treaty and ratify it.
Well,
and we're hoping that within the next year that'll happen, and then we'll begin working on NATO countries and the allies of the United States and work on from there.
I read an article by Schelling. It's called A World Without Nuclear Weapons. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It was assigned to me in my international relations class by Dr. Kramer, who her work outside the classroom is specifically to stop nuclear weapons, right? But this article basically says we can go to zero nuclear weapons because of the way the technology is. The states that have nuclear weapons, the disarmament to go to zero nuclear weapons, if they want a nuclear weapon, they have the ability to rebuild within 2 to 3 weeks, a month. Like, boom, they can re-up and get it back on track within a short period of time if they found the necessity to have a nuclear weapon. It basically just slows the train down for having the ability to drop a bomb immediately. You can't make an irrational decision, and that's part of the plus of going to zero nuclear weapons, is that we haven't lost the capability of building nuclear weapons. It doesn't mean you can't be nuclear weapon ready, but it does mean that we don't want to have nuclear. I mean, one of our big...
Well, that might be sort of a transition stage. But I think ultimately we're going to have to turn away from the entire nuclear technology. The feed materials that you would have for nuclear weapons, which existed in the spent fuel of every nuclear power plant. Those are the things that. This is why the two are going to eventually have to be banned altogether. Yeah. The Nuclear Ban Treaty recognizes the right for the peaceful use of atomic power, and our group and others tried to keep that out of that treaty, but and argued that it's unnecessary because it's already that right is already guaranteed under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But there were a number of countries that wouldn't have signed the Nuclear Ban Treaty without retaining the right to develop nuclear power. And that's another education process that we'll have to continue, is that we really are going to have to end up banning both. But it's an incremental process, and that's why this treaty wasn't perfect in that area at all. But it is definitely a giant
step. It's a step in the right direction. And frankly, it's kind of an incremental step. Like, you get states to say, okay, we'll go to zero, being able to be nuclear ready. And then once they're nuclear ready, they can realize that then we can work on the no need to have nuclear weapons. I mean, there is no need for nuclear anything on our planet, frankly. You know what, right. Chuck? We're about to end. Oh my gosh. Thanks, Chuck Johnson, Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. It's great.
Take care. Bye-bye.
You too.